Thank you, Pam. Carolyn has never been able to strike a match. When Pam asked her to do the chalice writing this morning, I thought, oh boy, here we go. But usually the little candle is usually lighted ahead of time, so you have a little head start, In fact, this is how Carolyn and I met. She asked me to light her Bunsen burner in a chemistry class. So maybe she has a reason for all that. I don't know. This is nice. Last year when I gave a talk, I marveled that there were actually people here beyond my mandatory family members on a beautiful summer day near a major holiday. And here you are again on a morning that many are using to pay tribute to the gods of consumerism, holiday shopping. But you have found your way here, and I thank you. Lessons from my youth. In our youth, we tend to accept things the way they are and question them sometime later in the future. Anywho, that's the way it was for me growing up in rural South Jersey in the 50s. The culture accepted attitudes about race and lifestyle, women's place in the world, men's place in the world as well. Attitudes that were worn out, archaic, and many times just plain mean-spirited and dangerous. All those idolized Eisenhower years, they also fostered and festered polio, xenophobia, separate drinking fountains. As a child, I had no yardstick to gauge these activities, but I was suspect of their validity. Years later, as I thought back on that time, I remembered events that opened a window onto that culture, events that made me question the rightness and wrongness of these episodes. I later collected them into a sequence of short story memoirs, all from the time I was coming of age, roughly between 11 and 16 years old. I'd like to share with you a handful of excerpts from those stories. I want to give you a heads up that some of the stories contain raw and offensive language that I heard in those times. I'm not apologetic because that's the point. Many attitudes of the time were offensive. Here's the first story. The Saturday night fights in black and white. I spent many Friday nights with my pop-pop watching the Gillette Friday night fights on his little black and white television. Those of you in my generation may remember the Look Sharp, Feel Sharp, Be Sharp theme song and the Gillette parrot flitting across the screen. I learned from Pop-Up the rules of rooting for the boxers. 2 white guys, and it was the luck of the Irish. A white boxer and a Negro. Negro was the accepted polite term back then. And it was always root for the white guy. 2 Negroes, and it was may the best boogie win. Well, in 1957, the big Swede Ingemar Johansson was defending his world heavyweight crown against the American Negro challenger, Floyd Patterson, from whom he had taken the crown the year before. Throughout the bout, I noticed Pop-Up becoming more and more enthusiastic for Patterson. It turned my boxing world upside down. I challenged him, Pop-Up, why are you rooting for the boogie? Pop-Up, looking at me with a hurt expression, said, but Bobby, he's our boogie. Now, Pop-Up wasn't an outright bigot. He would never purposely hurt another person. But he was a victim of his own times. Spick, kike, wop, boogie, fag, and worse, of course, were bandied about with abandon. Pop-Up was Irish. Others called him Mick. And in his youth, he surely was a victim of the policy that his kind need not apply. These attitudes were woven throughout the fabric of our culture, providing a backdrop for worse things than name-calling to occur. At every level of society, we had de facto segregation, and in much of our country, there was outright legal segregation. It took the civil rights movement in the next decade to truly change ourselves to become a better people. Another story I call a $3 bill. My father had an antique business, among other things, and Ray and Phil would come in from Atlantic City at least once a month to pick something up for their collection. My father always told me, they're as queer as $3 bills. We didn't use gay back then. In those days, gay still meant happy. Dad continued, and Phil, the little one, he's a New York Jew. You know, pushy and kind of know-it-all. But they're good customers, don't get me wrong. On one visit, I was loading their purchases into the back of their van. Ray and Phil were on the other side and thought that I could not see them. But I could, through the side view mirror. Phil did a strange thing. He leaned over, touched Ray's shoulder, gently kissed him on the lips. Imagine that, two bald men with pot bellies kissing. It was a tender kiss. I'd never seen my parents kiss that way. Their kisses were more like good morning pecks, a formality. In fact, Ray and Phil showed more affection for each other than I had ever seen from my parents. When I told my friend about this incident on Monday at school, he brushed it off and tackled another one of our pals in a game we called Smear the Queer. Another episode is called The Haircut and the CIA. The Cold War was pervasive in our thinking in the 50s. Our economy grew by leaps and bounds, yet we were still intimidated by the Soviet Union, which sank every ruble it had into warhead and space technology, while on the domestic front, women were still pulling plows across the fields, and most households got by on potatoes and vodka. This was the backdrop for my Uncle Jim digging his bomb shelter. A bomb shelter that I would inspect every couple of weeks when my cousins and I sat beside it for our backyard haircuts from Uncle Jim and his new shears. About that time, Uncle Jim also talked a lot about the CIA looking for him regarding some incident that he imagined from the Korean War. Eventually, my aunt, along with my father's help, committed Uncle Jim to Ancora State Mental Hospital for 6 months to deal with his paranoia schizophrenia. I learned of all this, including the shock treatments, through snatches of my parents' guarded conversations. Because, of course, we never discussed bad things. They didn't exist in the 50s. Nothing bad did, especially mental illness. So we kids fell headlong into adulthood without ever having the experience or counsel of facing bad times head on and figuring out what to do, or how we could best help Uncle Jim. Another story is called Dignity. The gateway to travel is a long-awaited rest stop exactly halfway between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. At the breakfast buffet, a 50-ish woman intently selected Fruit Loops and filled her styrofoam bowl. An older woman, her mother, helped her pour the milk. The older woman asked if her daughter had had enough milk. The younger replied, "Yes, I do," enunciating the syllables with care, but with a thick tongue. Her chubby face had the puffy look of a Down syndrome individual. I was standing near the counter. The clerk mumbled to no one in particular, "Little Chinese idiot. I didn't think they lived that long." Of course, she was neither Chinese nor an idiot, but with a mental capacity about 70% of most other people, her quality of life must be greatly reduced, right? But her flowered blouse was freshly ironed, her khaki skirt was crisp as well, her steely gray hair was cut close, clean, stylish, full, and her smile was contagious, even at 8 a.m. The mother, lean and a little stooped, was dressed similarly for travel. Her husband had recently died, and she and her daughter were taking a bus across Pennsylvania to spend time with family in Ohio. Losing her husband had been difficult enough. Reconciling the disappearance of father to her daughter, an added challenge. She met her daughter's daily needs now as she had since her daughter was born. She accepted a mother-daughter relationship that never matured as other parent and child relationships, but remained frozen in time. But they moved through life with dignity. I like to think that scenes like this one reveal that we are beyond old slurs like retard. But a recent survey acknowledged that the most used high school put-downs are still to call someone a retard or gay. Sanctity. Mrs. Washington would come on Saturday mornings in the spring and ask my grandfather, the other one, not Papa, to fish in our little farm pond. Grandfather would look at the short, round Negro woman and say, "Yes, indeed, Mrs. Washington. I believe your dinner table would certainly be a good place for my catfish to end up." Of course, he didn't tell her that we white people knew that in those days only Negroes ate catfish anyway, so what was the loss? Mrs. Washington joined my sister and me down by the pond and placed several worm-baited sapling poles along the bank. My sister and I had found a pool full of baby sunfish under the big willow tree. Only an inch or so long, they were swimming all over each other. We didn't even need bait. We just dangled our shiny hooks in the water, and our little sunnies jumped on. We pulled them out hand over fist, and soon there was a pile of them on a plank, flapping out their last flaps. When Mrs. Washington had caught her bucketful of fish for the day, she turned to us and said, "I'm going to put these fish in the trunk of my old car and drive them home. Then I'm going to batter these catties in cornmeal and fry them in lard till they are crispy." Looking at our growing pile of sunnies, she continued, "But what are you children going to do with those creatures you have baking in the sun there?" "We're not planning on doing anything with them. We're just catching them," I said. "Well, you know, there's catching and there's catching. I'm catching these for my family supper. I like to think that these fish are smiling just knowing how happy they are going to make my family." "But your catching is just plain cruel. You see, every creature is placed on this earth for a purpose. If you have to kill a creature, it should be for a very good reason. It's called the sanctity of life. And I don't see any sanctity at all for the death of those beautiful golden fish just rotting in the sun." My sister and I felt ashamed and scooped the fish back into the water, trying to resurrect them. A few swam off, but most floated belly up on the surface. We placed them in a shallow grave, and with a pencil from my tackle box, I spelled as best I could sanctity on the plank as a grave marker. Mrs. Washington approved and said, "Fish make good fertilizer. When you see grass and flowers growing in this spot, you will think sanctity." My final story is called The Cockfights. Excuse me. Thanks, Pam. One Saturday night, my friend Espen and I snuck into the Puerto Rican migrant camp up the road in Cross Keys to see the secret chicken fights. My parents didn't like the migrants. My mother said they were dirty and carried knives and lived in this country for free. When I think back on the so-called free conditions in which these folks lived, I have to think that they got no bargain in the deal. And to me, they were mysterious. They played guitars and found time to dance and laugh a lot, even though the work they did throughout the picking season was torturous and back-breaking piecework. There was a lot of gambling at chicken fights, but if they won, most of the money was sent back to the families on the island. And for sure, the chicken fights were not sanitized. They were bloody and gory, and there certainly was no regard for sanctity of life here. As I write about them, I don't condone what I saw, but I also must report a group of people given very few opportunities in life and doing the best they could to survive and find a brief respite from their daily grind wherever they could. If our situations were reversed, I wondered what I would do to provide for my family. There are many more stories that I haven't yet been able to pull from the fog. Most of them relate to a mantra of colloquialisms from within our lifetime. For instance, for many families, it was regarded a waste of time, a waste of money to send a girl to college just to come out and become a wife, mother, and housekeeper. Unless, of course, she could get a good husband at college. And following on the heels of some of the more militant feminists, there's the reverse put down of women who truly want to dedicate their lives to homemaking, being a mother and wife. Here's another. Doctors are men, nurses are women, a detriment to both professions. And another particularly hurtful one. Those who can do, those who can't teach, and on and on and on. What about women in the military? What if they are captured? Well, most warfare is conducted by sophisticated military personnel, women and men both, on computers, far from hand-to-hand combat. But next they'll be allowing gays in the military, or a woman president, or a Negro, or for God's sake, a Negro woman. All these lessons from my youth to live down, and I'm sure that this culture was not isolated to my community. I think it was national, probably global, and in much of the world still exists. Thank goodness in our country we're past these archaic attitudes that crippled the human race in the old days. Where are we? I belong to a group called the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has been fighting hate groups for decades. I first joined as a social studies teacher to get their educational materials on tolerance. Well, the banner headline from their newsletter earlier this year reads, U.S. Hate Groups Top 1,000. One reason given for the recent rise in hate groups was the election of the first Afro-American president. The newsletter had a map of the country with dots showing where these hate groups were located. Guess what? South Jersey was obliterated by dots. Neo-Nazis, racist skinheads, white nationalists, and based in my own community of Mays Landing, the Ku Klux Klan of all things. It's hard for individuals to speak out against ingrained prejudices that are still among us, but here at UUCSJS, I feel that we have each other's backs covered. It's so important that we have a culture here that goes beyond tolerance and supports acceptance. And spearheading our agenda has always been our Social Justice Committee, now Social Justice Ministry. Within my time here, it has been led by Jesse Connor and most recently Angela Jones. Now, after a brief hiatus to refocus, Social Justice under the leadership of Richard Gavinsky will open another chapter on our activism. With it, we have a forum to give voice against injustice in order to truly change cultural attitudes for the betterment of us all. Well, it's been decades after the fact that I began to organize the memories of these stories in some memoir journaling workshops that I attended. It was cathartic to recall things that were troubling and of which I did not understand when they were happening. With whatever wisdom I had gained as an adult, I was able to give some meaning to my story. I'd like to put together a similar venue of journal writing activities for any of you who would like a little guidance in writing out your own history, from youth or otherwise. The particulars are in your bulletin and the midweek announcements. The Adult RE Committee and I will have a sign-up on the back table today and for the next few weeks. Thank you for your tolerance and acceptance of my personal stories. I'd much like to hear yours as well.